Something unusual happened in that arena in Milan. Not a fall, not a mistake. Something quieter than that. The judges saw it first. Then the booth went quiet. Then the crowd felt it. Because, in the most stressful 4 minutes in figure skating, Alysa Liu was smiling. Not the camera smile. A real one. The kind you wear when you're having fun. And that was the strangest part. Everyone else looked terrified. Finals aren't supposed to look like joy. They're supposed to look like survival. So why did she skate like someone who'd already accepted losing and end up changing the whole night? The silence inside the arena that night felt heavy. Not loud, not dramatic, just thick. The kind of silence that settles over thousands of people when they know something important is about to happen. It was February 2026, in Milan. The women's Olympic figure skating final had reached its final performances. By that point in the evening, the crowd had already seen extraordinary routines. Quadruple jumps, near-perfect spins, programs executed with surgical precision. But the atmosphere around the last skater felt different. Alysa Liu stepped onto the ice slowly, almost casually, as if she were entering a practice rink rather than an Olympic final. Her posture didn't match the tension in the arena. Most skaters in that moment carry visible weight in their shoulders. You can see it in the way they inhale before the music starts. The pressure of years, sometimes decades, concentrated into 4 minutes. But Alysa looked relaxed, maybe even amused. One of the television commentators quietly pointed it out before the music began. "Look at her face. She seems completely calm." Calm was unusual, because the stakes were enormous. No American woman had won Olympic gold in figure skating since 2002. 24 years. An entire generation of skaters had come and gone, trying to change that. The pressure surrounding that drought had become its own invisible opponent. Every American skater who reached the Olympic stage carried it. But Alysa Liu didn't seem to be carrying anything. When the opening notes of the music echoed across the arena, she pushed off the ice with a smooth, almost effortless glide. The first few seconds of a routine often reveal everything. You can see hesitation. You can see nerves. You can see when an athlete is skating carefully, trying not to make mistakes. But Alysa's movements didn't look careful. They looked free. Her edges cut across the ice with a rhythm that felt more like dancing than competing. And that difference was subtle at first. The first jump came quickly. A triple combination, the kind elite skaters practice thousands of times in training. She landed it cleanly. The crowd applauded politely. Nothing unusual yet. But then something else happened. Instead of immediately shifting into the next element with the rigid focus most skaters display, Alysa let the movement breathe. She extended the glide, arms loose, shoulders relaxed. A moment of space. It looked less like someone executing choreography and more like someone listening to music. A second jump followed. Another clean landing. By this point, the technical panel watching from rinkside had already started marking scores. In Olympic skating, every landing matters. Not just whether a jump is completed, but how smoothly the skater exits it. Flow, speed, control. And Alysa's landings had something judges always reward: momentum. Each jump carried forward instead of stopping. No visible strain, no rushed recovery. The routine continued building. Spin, footwork sequence, another triple jump, still clean. But what people inside the arena began noticing wasn't just the technical consistency. It was her expression. Most Olympic skaters maintain what coaches call a performance face. Focused, controlled, slightly distant. A mask that hides nerves. Alysa didn't wear one. At one point, After landing a jump slightly off-center, she made a quick, playful expression, almost like a small whoops face, a tiny moment. But the cameras caught it, and suddenly the commentators laughed, not because she made a mistake, but because she reacted like a human being instead of a machine. That almost never happens at the Olympic level. At this stage, athletes are trained to erase emotion. Mistakes are buried immediately under discipline. But Alysa's reaction lasted barely a second before she flowed directly into the next movement. The audience responded instantly. Applause grew louder. Something about the routine felt lighter than the others that night. Less tense, more alive. And as the program reached its midpoint, the rhythm of the arena began to change. You could hear it in the crowd. Instead of the anxious quiet that usually follows every landing, that moment where thousands of people hold their breath, waiting to see if the skater stays upright, the audience started reacting faster, cheering mid-routine, clapping between elements, energy building, because by then people were starting to realize something unusual. Alysa Liu wasn't skating like someone trying to protect a score. She was skating like someone enjoying the moment, and in a sport built almost entirely on pressure. That difference looked almost rebellious. By the time the music reached its final crescendo, the arena was no longer quiet. It was alive. But the most interesting reactions weren't coming from the crowd. They were coming from the other skaters waiting backstage, because the athletes watching the monitor could see something the audience was only beginning to understand. Alysa Liu wasn't skating cautiously. She wasn't skating safely. And she definitely wasn't skating afraid. And that, more than any jump, was the most dangerous thing happening on that ice. Backstage, the atmosphere felt very different from the energy building in the arena. The television cameras focused on Alysa Liu skating under bright lights, but behind the curtain, another scene was unfolding quietly. Several of the other finalists were standing near the monitor that showed the live broadcast, watching. Figure skaters always watch the final performances of their rivals, not because they enjoy it, most of the time they don't, but because the scoreboard depends on it. Every landing changes the equation. Every jump shifts the pressure. And what they were seeing on the screen was unusual. Not because Alysa was doing the hardest program of the night. She wasn't. Some of the other skaters had attempted quadruple jumps earlier in the final. Those jumps carry higher base value, higher risk, higher reward. But they also carry something else: fear. Quadruple jumps are brutally difficult. Even the best skaters in the world fall on them regularly, which means every attempt comes with tension. Muscles tighten. Timing becomes fragile. One small hesitation, and the jump collapses. That tension had been visible throughout the entire competition. Earlier in the evening, several skaters stepped onto the ice with expressions that looked almost frozen. One athlete spent nearly 30 seconds at center ice before the music started, breathing slowly and staring at the rink. Another skater visibly shook her hands before her opening jump, trying to release the nerves in her fingers. None of that was unusual. Olympic finals do that to people. The event compresses years of training into 4 minutes, thousands of hours, childhood sacrifices, family expectations, national pressure. All of it balanced on the edge of a blade. That kind of weight changes how athletes move. You can see it in their posture, in the way their shoulders rise slightly before jumps, in the way they skate a little more carefully than usual. Because, at the Olympic level, mistakes don't just cost points, they become headlines. And the skaters waiting backstage knew exactly what that pressure felt like. Most of them had spent their entire lives chasing this moment. Some began training when they were 5 years old, before they fully understood what competition meant, before they understood what pressure could do, and by the time they reached the Olympic stage, the sport had already shaped their lives around a single objective: win, or at least survive without mistakes. But watching Alysa Liu on the monitor, something about her movement looked unfamiliar. One skater reportedly leaned closer to the screen as Alysa completed another clean jump, not because the jump itself was shocking, but because of how she landed it. There was no hesitation, no immediate correction, just speed continuing across the ice. The kind of landing coaches describe as flow. That detail matters more than most viewers realize, because when skaters are nervous, they often tighten their bodies during jumps. Even if they land successfully, the landing becomes rigid. Momentum stops. The program becomes slightly mechanical. But Alysa's landings kept moving. That suggested something important. She wasn't skating with tension. She was skating loose. And loose skaters are dangerous competitors, because when fear disappears, consistency improves. One of the commentators later described it in simple terms during the broadcast: "She doesn't look like she's protecting anything." That sentence hung quietly in the air. Protecting something is exactly what Olympic athletes usually do. Protecting rankings, protecting reputation, protecting years of work. But Alysa Liu had already done something few Olympic contenders ever experience. She had walked away from the sport once. In 2022, shortly after the Beijing Winter Olympics, Alysa made a decision that shocked the skating world. At 16 years old, younger than many athletes entering their prime, she announced she was retiring. Just like that. No long farewell tour. No gradual transition. She stepped away. At the time, she later explained in interviews, skating had stopped feeling joyful. Years of competition had turned the sport into something heavy, something she no longer recognized. And when an athlete reaches that point, there are usually two options: push through it or leave. Alysa left, which meant something very unusual happened over the next 2 years. For the first time since childhood, her life stopped revolving around skating. No daily training schedule, no competitions every few weeks, no scores, just normal life. College classes, friends, travel. Moments most elite athletes never get to experience during their competitive years. Those 2 years changed something. Because when Alysa eventually returned to skating in 2024, the motivation was different. She wasn't chasing expectations anymore. She had already escaped them once, and that difference was quietly visible on the ice in Milan, while other skaters carried the weight of everything they had sacrificed to reach the Olympics. Alysa Liu looked like someone who had nothing left to prove. Backstage, the skaters watching the monitor could sense that difference, because athletes recognize emotional states faster than spectators. They know what fear looks like. They know what pressure does to movement. And they could see that Alysa Liu wasn't skating with either of those things. She was skating freely, which meant something very uncomfortable for her competitors. If someone like that starts landing every jump, they become almost impossible to stop. And as the routine moved toward its final elements, a quiet realization began forming backstage. This might not just be another clean Olympic performance. This might be something else entirely. Something none of them had prepared for. Because the most dangerous athlete in a final isn't always the one attempting the hardest elements. Sometimes, it's the one who isn't afraid anymore. The strange part about that Olympic routine in Milan didn't begin in the arena. It actually started 2 years earlier, and almost nobody in that crowd knew it. Because in early 2024, Alysa Liu walked into a public skating rink in California for the first time in a long while. No cameras, no federation officials, No Olympic expectations, just a quiet rink, the faint scrape of blades on ice, and a few recreational skaters circling slowly under fluorescent lights. At that moment, Alysa Liu wasn't an Olympic contender. She wasn't even an active competitor. For nearly 2 years, she had been something very rare in elite sports, a former prodigy who simply disappeared. When she retired in 2022, the announcement stunned the skating world. Most Olympic athletes peak in their 20s, some even later. But Alysa stepped away at 16, young enough that many athletes her age were just entering senior competitions. To people outside the sport, the decision seemed confusing. Why leave so early? But people inside figure skating understood something that casual viewers often miss. Prodigies live under enormous pressure. From the moment Alysa burst onto the national scene, expectations formed quickly. At 13 years old, she became the youngest U.S. national champion in decades, a record that instantly changed the trajectory of her career. Suddenly, she wasn't just another young skater. She was the future of American skating. Media attention grew. Sponsors followed. Every competition became another test of whether she could fulfill the promise everyone had placed on her shoulders. And that kind of expectation builds quietly, day after day, season after season, until eventually the sport begins to feel less like skating and more like responsibility. By the time Alysa competed at the Beijing Winter Olympics in 2022, she was already one of the most technically advanced skaters in the United States. But something about the experience felt different from what people watching on television imagined. Later, in interviews, she explained it in simple terms. She didn't hate skating itself. She hated what skating had become. Schedules, pressure, constant evaluation, scores that defined success or failure within seconds. When the Olympic season ended, she made a choice that shocked coaches, commentators, and fans alike. She walked away. Just like that. No announcement of a return date. No promise to reconsider later. She simply stepped into a life outside elite sport. For a while, skating disappeared from her routine entirely. She enrolled in college, studied psychology, experienced things she had rarely had time for growing up in elite training environments. Late-night conversations with friends, campus life, travel, normal days. And the strange thing about normal life is that it changes perspective. When athletes spend years inside competitive systems, the sport becomes their entire identity. Stepping outside that system can feel almost disorienting at first, but it also creates distance. Distance from expectations, distance from pressure, distance from the constant voice asking whether every performance is good enough. That distance was what Alysa Liu experienced during those 2 years away, which is why the moment she stepped onto that quiet public rink in 2024 mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Because she didn't go there to train. She went there to test something. Whether the feeling of skating still existed. Not competition, not scores. Just the sensation of gliding across ice. For a while, she skated slowly. Simple turns, edges, nothing difficult. No jumps. People at the rink barely noticed who she was. To them, she looked like any other skater practicing on a quiet afternoon. But eventually, something familiar returned. The rhythm. The feeling of speed. The small burst of adrenaline when a movement connects perfectly with the music in your head. It wasn't the pressure she remembered. It was the joy. That moment changed something. Because suddenly, skating wasn't the thing she had escaped from anymore. It was simply something she enjoyed again. That difference might sound small, but psychologically it changes everything. When athletes return to a sport by choice instead of obligation, The relationship with competition becomes completely different. Fear loses its grip. Expectations fade. The performance becomes personal again. And once that shift happened, the idea of competing again began to feel possible. Not necessary, just possible. By early 2024, Alysa quietly began skating more often, still without the full structure of elite training, still without the intensity of Olympic preparation, but enough to notice something surprising. Her body remembered. Years of training don't disappear. Muscle memory remains buried deep inside the nervous system. Jumps returned gradually. Triple jumps first, then combinations. Soon the rhythm of competitive skating began resurfacing. Friends and coaches who saw her skate again noticed something unusual. She looked lighter, less rigid, more expressive. The difference wasn't technical, it was emotional. The pressure that once defined her skating simply wasn't there anymore, and that change would become the most important advantage she carried into the Olympic season. Because by the time she returned to international competition, Alysa Liu wasn't skating for expectations. She wasn't skating to prove anyone wrong. She was skating because she wanted to, which meant that when she eventually stepped onto the Olympic ice in Milan, she brought something no training program can teach: freedom. And freedom, in a sport built on pressure, can be the most dangerous weapon of all. By the time Alysa Liu's program reached its second half in Milan, something subtle had already shifted inside the arena. At first, it was just energy, the kind that moves quietly through a crowd before anyone fully understands why. Olympic audiences are experienced. Many of the people watching that night had followed figure skating for years, some for decades. They knew the rhythm of a routine. They knew when tension builds and when it breaks, and they could feel that this performance was building toward something. The first half of Alysa's routine had already been clean. Every jump landed, every transition smooth. The judges were quietly recording scores at rinkside, while commentators continued describing the technical details for viewers at home. But inside the arena, something more instinctive was happening. People were leaning forward, because the second half of a figure skating program is where pressure becomes real. Fatigue begins to creep into the legs. Timing becomes fragile. Even the best athletes sometimes lose control of landings once exhaustion begins to set in. That's why the most difficult jumps are often placed early in routines. Safer strategy. Reduce risk. But Alysa Liu wasn't skating like someone following a cautious strategy. She accelerated into the second half of the program with the same rhythm she had started with. No visible tension. No slowing down. Just movement. The next jump approached quickly, a triple Lutz combination, technically demanding but well within her abilities when performed confidently. She launched into the air with sharp precision, rotation tight, landing clean. But what made the landing remarkable wasn't the jump itself. It was the exit, instead of a stiff correction, the kind athletes make when trying to stabilize a difficult landing. Alysa flowed directly into the next step sequence without breaking speed. That detail mattered, because judges reward what they call flow out. Momentum. Control that continues beyond the jump itself. And Alysa's momentum never stopped. A murmur moved through the crowd. Small at first, but growing. Commentators noticed it too. One of them said quietly, almost surprised, "She's gaining energy, not losing it." That was unusual. By this point in most Olympic routines, athletes begin conserving movement, saving strength for the final elements. But Alysa Liu looked like she was enjoying the music more with each passing second. Her edges deepened across the ice. Her footwork sequence accelerated with rhythm. And then came the spin. Centered perfectly. Speed increasing, until the blades carved a near-perfect circle beneath her. When she finished the spin, the applause inside the arena grew noticeably louder. Now the audience understood something. This wasn't just a clean routine. It was becoming a performance. And performances change how judges see skating. Figure skating scoring is technical, yes, but it also contains something less measurable. Performance components, interpretation, presence, connection with the music, connection with the audience. Alysa Liu was checking every one of those boxes. Another jump approached. Triple flip. Clean again. The landing sent a small spray of ice into the air as she accelerated across the rink. At this point, the technical panel already knew something important. If she completed the remaining elements successfully, her score would climb into territory that could challenge for gold. But the arena didn't know that yet. The crowd only knew what they could see. And what they were seeing was a skater who looked completely comfortable in the most uncomfortable situation imaginable. Backstage, the athletes watching the monitor had grown noticeably quieter. Some had already completed their programs earlier that night. Others were still calculating what scores might mean for final placements. But now, those calculations were becoming less optimistic. Because Alysa Liu hadn't shown a single major weakness. No shaky landing, no stumble, no visible nerves. The final jump approached. One last moment where everything could still change. Even Olympic champions sometimes lose control in the final seconds of a routine. Fatigue, overconfidence, one small miscalculation. The crowd held its breath. Alysa entered the jump with speed. Rotation came quickly. She landed clean. And this time the reaction inside the arena wasn't cautious applause. It was a burst of noise. Because, by that moment, thousands of people understood something simultaneously. This routine had worked. But Alysa Liu didn't celebrate. She didn't raise her arms. She didn't slow down dramatically. Instead, she continued skating through the final choreography of the program with the same relaxed rhythm she had carried from the beginning. Music building, movement flowing, and then the final pose. When the music ended, the arena erupted. People stood. Applause thundered across the ice. Some spectators were already clapping above their heads. Others simply stared in disbelief at what they had just watched. But the most revealing reactions came from the judges, because they had spent the entire routine watching carefully, calculating, comparing, and they knew what the audience was only beginning to suspect. This score might change everything. But even before the numbers appeared on the scoreboard, one thing had already become clear. Alysa Liu hadn't just delivered a clean Olympic routine. She had done something much rarer. She had turned one of the most stressful moments in sports into something that looked almost effortless. And that kind of performance has a way of rewriting competitions before the results are even announced. For a few seconds after the music ended, Alysa Liu stood alone at the center of the rink. The applause was still echoing through the arena, bouncing off the high ceilings of the Olympic venue in Milan. Thousands of spectators were on their feet, some still clapping, some simply watching quietly. But Alysa herself looked almost calm again. Not overwhelmed, not shocked, just waiting. In figure skating, there is always a strange pause after a performance. The athlete leaves the ice and sits with their coach in a small area beside the rink while judges finalize the score. It's often the most uncomfortable part of the competition. The adrenaline begins to fade. The mind starts replaying every movement, every jump. Did the rotation look clean? Did the landing lose speed? Did the judges notice the small correction after the spin? Most skaters in that moment sit rigidly beside their coaches, eyes fixed on the scoreboard. But Alysa Liu leaned slightly forward in her chair, still breathing steadily. Her expression relaxed in a way that seemed almost out of place. If anything, she looked curious. The camera zoomed in. Her coach spoke quietly beside her, pointing once toward the rink where judges were completing their calculations. Then, the arena lights shifted slightly as the scoreboard prepared to display the final numbers. A small murmur moved through the crowd. Everyone knew this score would determine the Olympic champion. One by one, the numbers appeared. Technical score first, then the program components, then the total. For a brief moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that happens when thousands of people read the same number at the same time. And then the arena erupted. Because the total placed Alysa Liu at the top of the standings. Olympic gold. The first American woman to win the Olympic figure skating title in 24 years. The drought that had hovered over U.S. skating since 2002 had finally ended. The camera returned to Alysa. Her reaction was almost understated. She smiled. Not the dramatic collapse to the ice that sometimes follows Olympic victories. Not tears, just a wide, genuine smile. And then a short laugh, as if she herself couldn't quite believe how the moment had unfolded. Her coach hugged her. Applause continued rising inside the arena. But what made that victory unusual wasn't just the medal. It was how it happened. For years, modern figure skating had become increasingly technical. The sport had pushed athletes toward more rotations, higher difficulty, greater risk. Quadruple jumps had begun dominating headlines. Programs were often built around extreme difficulty, but Alysa Liu had taken a slightly different path that night. Instead of chasing the most dangerous jumps possible, she focused on something else. Execution, flow, connection with the music. 7 clean triple jumps. Not reckless, precise. The judges rewarded that balance, and the audience responded even more strongly. Because what people remembered most about the routine wasn't the jump layout or the technical details, it was the feeling. Alysa Liu had skated like someone enjoying herself. In a sport where pressure often defines the atmosphere, that difference felt almost revolutionary. Commentators began describing the performance in simple terms: freedom, joy, confidence. Words not always associated with Olympic finals. But the story didn't end inside that arena. In the weeks following the Games, something unexpected began appearing online. Athletes from other sports started mentioning Alysa Liu in interviews. Some said her story reminded them why they began competing in the first place. Others talked about stepping away from sports they had abandoned years earlier. Journalists began referring to it as something informal but powerful. The Alysa Liu effect. The idea that stepping away,